After years of studying neuroscientists and memory researchers, I discovered something that completely changed the way I understand the past. Your memories are not recordings of what happened. They are reconstructions that your brain modifies every time you remember them. And the implications of that single fact are more profound and more personal than almost anything else I've encountered in any area of science. It changes what your past actually is. It changes what your identity is built on. It changes what the legal system does when it relies on eyewitness testimony. It changes what therapists are doing when they help people process traumatic memories. It changes what happens when two people who live through the same event remember it completely differently and are both certain they are right. It changes everything. Once you actually understand the mechanism, I want to take you through exactly what I found, because this is not a comfortable subject. The research on memory does not tell you that your memories are mostly accurate with some minor distortions. It tells you that memory is fundamentally a reconstructive process, that every act of remembering actively changes the memory, that false memories can be implanted and can feel completely indistinguishable from real ones, and that your confidence in a memory is essentially unrelated to its accuracy. These findings have been replicated across decades of research by some of the most careful scientists in cognitive neuroscience, and they have consequences that extend far beyond the academic. Let me start with the foundational science, because I think understanding the mechanism is what makes everything that follows comprehensible rather than just surprising. Memory in the brain is not like a video file stored on a hard drive. The video file analogy is one of the most persistently misleading metaphors in all of popular psychology. A video file is a static record. Once written, it does not change unless you actively edit it. Retrieving it does not modify it. And the file you retrieve today is identical to the file you stored last year. Memory in the brain operates on entirely different principles. Memory is stored not as a fixed record, but as a pattern of synaptic connections distributed across multiple brain regions. When a memory is formed, a specific pattern of neuronal activation produces changes in synaptic strength, the process called long-term potentiation, across a network of neurons called an engram. The engram is not the memory. It is the physical substrate, the specific pattern of synaptic changes that allows the memory to be reconstructed when appropriate cues are present. And each time the memory is reconstructed, the process of reconstruction involves activating the engram neurons, which then produce a pattern of neural activity that represents the memory that is experienced as remembering. But here is the crucial point that changes everything. The process of retrieving a memory puts it in a labile state, a state in which it is temporarily susceptible to modification. And it can then be reconsolidated in a modified form, incorporating information from the current context, the current emotional state, the current knowledge, and anything else that is present at the time of retrieval. The memory that is stored after retrieval is not identical to the one that was stored before retrieval. It has been updated. Retrieval is not reading. Retrieval is rewriting. This process is called reconsolidation, and the research on it has transformed our understanding of memory over the past 2 decades. The key experiments were conducted by Karim Nader, Glenn Schaaf, and Joseph Ledoux at New York University. Published in a landmark paper in Nature in 2000, they showed in rats that a fear memory, once reactivated, requires a new round of protein synthesis to be maintained. If protein synthesis in the amygdala is blocked immediately after the memory is reactivated, the memory is erased. But if the same protein synthesis blocker is given without reactivating the memory, or if it is given several hours after reactivation when reconsolidation has completed, the memory is unaffected. This demonstrated that reactivated memories go through a reconsolidation process that requires new protein synthesis, and that this process is a genuine molecular event, not a metaphor. Subsequent research has demonstrated reconsolidation in humans and has shown that during the reconsolidation window, which lasts approximately several hours after reactivation, memories are vulnerable to modification by new information, emotional state changes, pharmacological interventions, and other contextual factors. Every time you remember something, you open a reconsolidation window during which the memory can be changed before it is stored again. And the version stored after that reconsolidation is slightly different from the version before. The practical consequence of reconsolidation is that memory changes with each remembering, not randomly, not in unpredictable ways, but in specific, systematic ways that are shaped by the current context, current beliefs, current emotional state, and the post-event information that has been encountered since the original experience. The memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus at the University of California, Irvine, has spent 5 decades documenting these systematic distortions, and her work is among the most practically important and most controversial in all of cognitive psychology. Her research on the misinformation effect, the contamination of memory by post-event information, has demonstrated with extraordinary consistency that memories of events can be altered by subsequent information provided after the event. In her classic experiments, subjects view a film of a traffic accident and are then asked questions that contain misleading information about the event. Subjects who are asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other give higher speed estimates and are more likely to falsely remember seeing broken glass than subjects who are asked about when the cars hit each other. The word smashed, not present in the original film, has been incorporated into the memory. Research has shown that the misinformation effect works through the reconsolidation mechanism. When the memory is retrieved to answer the question, the misleading information in the question is present in the retrieval context and can be incorporated into the memory during reconsolidation. The original memory and the misinformation become confused, and the resulting reconstructed memory may contain elements from both without any subjective sense that two sources have been blended. The most dramatic demonstration of how malleable memory is comes from research on the implantation of entirely false memories. Loftus and her colleagues have shown that it is possible to create in subjects detailed, vivid, emotionally resonant memories of events that never occurred. In one of the most striking demonstrations of this, Loftus and her colleague Jacqueline Pickrell used a technique they called the Lost in the Mall study. They convinced subjects that they had been lost in a shopping mall as a child, a distressing experience they did not actually have. By providing a brief written description of the event, attributing it to a family member, and asking the subjects to think about and try to remember it, they were able to induce 25% of subjects to produce memories of the event, complete with details and emotional content. In subsequent sessions, subjects elaborated on these false memories, adding details and expressing certainty about events that had not occurred. The memories were not weak or vague. They were vivid, confident, and felt real. In other research, subjects have been implanted with false memories of nearly drowning as a child, of being attacked by a vicious animal, of committing a crime, and even of witnessing demonic possession. In a striking series of studies by Stephen Porter at the University of British Columbia, 50% of subjects were induced to produce rich false memories of committing a criminal act, including assault, in their adolescence. These subjects had not committed these acts. The memories were created through a combination of suggestion, guided imagery, and the pressure of an interview that communicated the expectation that the subject would eventually remember. After repeated sessions, half of the participants produced full or partial false memories of committing crimes they had not committed, with sensory detail, emotional content, and confidence that they had actually experienced these events. This research is not merely academically interesting, it has direct and profound practical consequences in several domains. The most significant is the legal system. Eyewitness testimony has historically been one of the most persuasive forms of evidence in criminal trials. A witness who confidently identifies a defendant, who provides detailed and consistent accounts of what they saw, is compelling to juries. And the research on eyewitness memory has demonstrated over and over again that eyewitness testimony is deeply unreliable in ways that are not detectably related to the witness's confidence. The Innocence Project, which has used DNA evidence to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals in the United States, has found that mistaken eyewitness identification was a contributing factor in approximately 70% of wrongful convictions. Not because the witnesses were lying, because the witnesses genuinely remembered something that did not happen. Memory contamination, suggestive questioning, leading lineup procedures, and the reconsolidation of original memories with information encountered during and after the investigation all contribute to producing confident, detailed, deeply felt memories of things that did not occur. And the tragedy is that the subjective experience of false memory is indistinguishable from the subjective experience of accurate memory. There is no reliable internal marker that distinguishes the two. The research on individual differences in susceptibility to false memory has produced important findings about who is most vulnerable to memory contamination. Contrary to what you might expect, higher intelligence is not reliably protective against false memories. Some research suggests that individuals with higher verbal intelligence and more vivid imagery may actually be more susceptible to certain types of false memory implantation because they are better able to generate rich sensory detail around suggested events, which makes the resulting false memories more convincing even to themselves. The trait of dissociative tendency, the ability to become deeply absorbed in internal imagery and to lose track of the boundary between imagination and memory, is a stronger predictor of false memory susceptibility than general intelligence. Sleep deprivation increases false memory susceptibility, possibly because the consolidation processes during which original memories are stabilized are disrupted. An emotional state at the time of suggestion matters. High emotional arousal can both enhance certain aspects of memory and increase susceptibility to certain kinds of distortion. The emotional dimension of memory is a rich area in itself that deserves specific treatment. The amygdala, which is the brain structure most centrally involved in the processing of emotionally significant events, has dense connections to the hippocampus, the structure most centrally involved in the formation and retrieval of episodic memories. Emotional arousal enhances memory consolidation through the amygdala's modulation of hippocampal activity, which is why emotionally charged events are generally remembered more vividly and in more detail than emotionally neutral ones. This is adaptive. Events that were emotionally significant were probably more important for survival and therefore more worth remembering. But the enhancement of memory by emotion does not mean emotional memories are more accurate. The research on flashbulb memories, the vivid, confident memories people have of where they were and what they were doing when they learned of a major public event, such as the September 11 attacks or the assassination of a political leader, has shown that these memories feel extraordinarily vivid and certain, and yet are frequently wrong in their details. Research by Jennifer Tallarico and David Rubin showed that flashbulb memories of learning about the September 11 attacks were no more accurate when tested 9 months later than memories of ordinary events from the same period, despite being rated as significantly more vivid and more certain. The subjective sense of a memory's vividness and the subjective sense of certainty about it are not reliable guides to its accuracy. They tell you about the emotional intensity of the memory, not about whether what you remember is what happened. Trauma memory is an especially important and especially contested area because the stakes of understanding it correctly are very high. Research on trauma memory has produced a picture that is more complex and more nuanced than either the popular view that traumatic memories are especially accurate, burned in by the intensity of the experience, or the claim that traumatic memories are especially unreliable and subject to massive distortion. The evidence suggests that traumatic memories are subject to the same reconstructive processes as all other memories, with some additional features. Trauma memory is often fragmented. Rather than a coherent narrative, the memory consists of sensory fragments, particularly visual and olfactory memories, emotional states, and body sensations, with poor narrative coherence. This fragmentation is associated with the effects of high cortisol and other stress hormones on hippocampal function during the traumatic event, which impairs the hippocampus's ability to bind the components of the experience into a coherent episodic memory. The amygdala-based emotional memory of the event may be strong and persistent, while the hippocampal narrative memory is fragmented and incomplete. Research on the recovery of memory for childhood sexual abuse has been particularly contentious. There is genuine evidence that memories for traumatic events can be suppressed and later recovered, though the mechanism for this and the accuracy of recovered memories are matters of significant scientific debate. There is also extensive evidence that memories for traumatic events that never occurred can be implanted through the same processes that produce other false memories, and that the process of psychotherapy if it involves suggestive techniques or strong expectation that abuse occurred and was forgotten, can produce false memories with the same vivid, confident character as accurate ones. The practical implications for therapeutic practice are serious, and the field has grappled extensively with guidelines for working with potentially traumatic memories in ways that are both clinically effective and epistemically responsible. The constructive nature of memory is not only relevant to the question of whether specific memories are accurate, it is also fundamental to understanding how memory contributes to identity and to the self. The philosopher and psychologist William James described the self as the remembered self, the continuous narrative of past experience and present situation that constitutes the sense of being a specific person with a specific history. The research on memory and identity has shown that this narrative self is not a passive repository of accurately recorded experience, but an active and ongoing construction that is shaped by current beliefs, current goals, current social context, and the specific memories that have been rehearsed and elaborated over time. Research by Michael Conway at City University, London on the self-memory system has shown that autobiographical memory is organized around a personal narrative framework that serves current goals and self-conceptions. Memories that are consistent with current self-concept are more readily retrieved. Memories that are inconsistent with current self-concept are less readily retrieved or are remembered in modified forms that reduce the inconsistency. The self uses memory to maintain its coherence, and in doing so, it selectively retrieves and constructs memories in ways that serve current identity rather than accurately representing the historical past. This means that your sense of who you are and where you came from is built on a foundation that is substantially constructed rather than accurately recorded. The positive side of this constructivity is that it allows the self to adapt and develop over time. A completely accurate and unchangeable memory would preserve all experiences, including all negative experiences, with equal fidelity and would make it impossible to move on from the past or to integrate difficult experiences into a coherent narrative of personal growth. The constructive nature of memory is what allows people to make sense of their experiences over time, to integrate apparently inconsistent memories into a coherent story, and to revise their understanding of past events in light of new experience and new understanding. The person you were at 20 does not remember the events of your teenage years in the same way that the person you are now does. The memories have been shaped by everything that happened between then and now, by the person you have become, by the understanding you have developed, by the relationships that have formed and changed. This is not a distortion. It is the normal and adaptive process by which experience is integrated into identity. The problem is not that memory is constructive. The problem is when the constructive process produces errors with serious practical consequences, as in eyewitness testimony, or when the process of memory reconsolidation is exploited, intentionally or unintentionally, in ways that produce false beliefs about important personal events. The research on prospective memory, memory for future intentions, is something I want to briefly address because it rounds out the picture of how memory actually functions in daily life. Prospective memory is the capacity to remember to do something at a future time or in response to a future cue. Forgetting to take medication, forgetting a scheduled appointment, forgetting to pass on a message. All of these are failures of prospective memory. Research has shown that prospective memory operates through a fundamentally different mechanism than retrospective memory. Rather than reconstructing a past experience, it involves maintaining a prospective cue in memory and monitoring the environment for the appropriate trigger. The failure modes of prospective memory are correspondingly different. It fails when the retrieval cue is not encountered, when attention is not available to monitor for the cue, or when the intention is not sufficiently encoded in the first place. The research on improving prospective memory has shown that specific implementation intentions, explicit plans of the form, when I encounter this specific situation, I will do this specific thing, dramatically improve the reliability of prospective memory relative to vague intentions. This is one of the most directly applicable findings in memory research for improving daily functioning. The research on the 7 sins of memory, as described by Daniel Schachter at Harvard in his influential framework, provides a comprehensive taxonomy of the ways memory fails that is worth covering because it organizes the full scope of memory error into a coherent picture. The 7 sins are transience, the fading of memory over time; absent-mindedness, the failure to encode information due to divided attention; blocking, the temporary failure to retrieve information that is available in memory; Misattribution, the attribution of a memory to the wrong source. Suggestibility, the incorporation of misleading post-event information into memory. Bias, the distortion of memory by current knowledge, beliefs, and feelings. And persistence, the unwanted recurrence of memories that cause distress. Schachter points out that these are not random failures of an otherwise reliable system. They are the predictable consequences of how memory is designed to work. Transience occurs because memory systems that forget unimportant information after it is no longer needed function more efficiently than systems that retain everything indefinitely. Absent-mindedness occurs because attention is finite, and the encoding of memories requires attentional resources that are not always available. Misattribution occurs because the source monitoring system that tracks the origins of memories is separate from the system that encodes the content, and source information is more easily lost than content information. Understanding these failures in terms of the adaptive design of the memory system, rather than simply as errors, provides both a more accurate picture of what memory is for and more specific guidance about when and how it can be expected to fail. The neuroscience of memory consolidation during sleep is an area I want to address, specifically because it is both scientifically important and directly actionable. Memory consolidation, the process by which freshly formed memories are stabilized and integrated into long-term storage, occurs primarily during sleep. During slow-wave sleep, the hippocampus, which holds newly formed memories in a temporary labile state, replays the day's experiences to the neocortex, transferring them to more stable long-term storage. During REM sleep, emotional memories are processed, and their emotional charge is reduced through a mechanism that appears to involve replaying the memory in a neurochemical environment that lacks norepinephrine, allowing the memory to be consolidated without the emotional intensity of the original experience. Research by Matthew Walker at Berkeley and his colleagues has shown that sleep deprivation dramatically impairs memory consolidation, not only reducing the efficiency of encoding, but also interfering with the reconsolidation of previously formed memories. The practical implication is direct. Learning followed by sleep produces significantly better retention than learning followed by continued wakefulness. And the sleep should follow learning as soon as reasonably possible because the consolidation window is most active in the first hours of sleep. The research also suggests that strategic napping immediately after learning can partially substitute for full nighttime sleep in producing consolidation benefits, though with smaller magnitude. Let me now give you the practical framework that I assembled from all of this research, because the most valuable thing I can offer is translating the neuroscience of memory into guidance that changes how you approach your own memory, your relationships, and your past. The first principle is epistemic humility about your own memories. This does not mean doubting everything you remember or refusing to act on memories. It means holding your memories as reconstructions rather than recordings. Particularly for emotionally charged, long ago, or frequently rehearsed memories, the probability that what you currently remember reflects exactly what happened is lower than it feels. The confidence with which you remember something is not a reliable indicator of its accuracy. This matters most in interpersonal conflicts where two people remember the same event differently and are both certain they are right. Understanding that both memories are reconstructions that have been shaped by each person's subsequent experience, emotional state, and current beliefs opens the possibility of recognizing that both people are probably partly right, rather than treating the conflict as a matter of one person lying and one telling the truth. The second principle is being careful about rehearsing memories with emotional charge, because each rehearsal is also a reconsolidation opportunity that can modify the memory. This works in both directions. Deliberate reappraisal of a distressing memory during retrieval, consciously bringing new context and new meaning to it, can produce genuine modification of the emotional charge of the stored memory. This is one of the mechanisms through which cognitive behavioral therapy produces changes in emotional responses to past events. But it also means that ruminating on negative memories, rehearsing them with the same emotional charge and the same distorted interpretation, can strengthen and deepen those distortions. What you do with a memory during retrieval is not neutral. It shapes what you will remember next time. The third principle is being specifically cautious about post-event information contaminating important memories. If you witnessed an event that may have legal or practical significance, be aware that information encountered after the event, through conversations with others, through media coverage, through being questioned in suggestive ways, can be incorporated into your memory of the event during reconsolidation. Keeping an immediate written record of what you remember before encountering post-event information provides a baseline that is less contaminated by subsequent influence. The fourth principle is prioritizing sleep after learning anything important. The consolidation window is real, and the research on it is robust. Learning material in the evening and sleeping on it produces better retention than learning it in the morning and staying awake for another 16 hours before sleeping. And the emotional processing that occurs during REM sleep is one of the most important mechanisms for integrating difficult experiences without being permanently dysregulated by their emotional charge. The most important single insight I want to leave you with is this: the story you tell yourself about your past is not a record of what happened. It is a living document that is being continuously rewritten in light of who you are now and what you now understand. The memories that constitute your personal history are not fixed. They are flexible, and that flexibility, properly understood, is not a flaw to be feared. It is the mechanism by which human beings can grow, can revise their understanding of the past in light of the present, can integrate difficult experiences into coherent narratives of who they are. The person who is stuck, who cannot move beyond a painful past, is often the person whose memory of that past is frozen in a specific, rigid form that cannot be revised or integrated. The person who has genuinely moved forward has usually done so partly through the constructive process of memory itself, through finding new meaning, new context, and new understanding that modifies how the past is remembered. This is what therapy facilitates. This is what time facilitates. This is what genuine new experience facilitates. Not the erasure of the past, but its reinterpretation through a memory system that never stops being a living reconstruction. The research does not give you a past that you can trust completely, but it gives you something in some ways more valuable, an understanding of your past as something you are continuously creating, not something that was fixed by events and that you simply carry. Your relationship to your own history is one of the most intimate creative acts of your life, and understanding the neuroscience of that creation gives you more agency over it than most people have ever imagined. Thank you for your time. I want to go considerably deeper on several areas because they deserve fuller treatment and because the additional specificity is what makes the research genuinely transformative rather than merely interesting. Let me start with the specific neuroscience of how memories are stored, because I think understanding the biology changes how you relate to the fragility of memory in a way that the psychological findings alone do not. When an experience occurs, the neurons that are active during the experience undergo changes in synaptic strength through a process called long-term potentiation, or LTP. LTP involves changes at individual synapses. The postsynaptic neuron becomes more responsive to input from the presynaptic neuron through mechanisms including the insertion of additional AMPA receptors into the postsynaptic membrane and the structural growth of dendritic spines. These changes are initially fragile. The proteins that produce and maintain LTP have a limited lifespan, and if they are not replenished through a consolidation process, the memory fades. The consolidation process requires new protein synthesis, which is why the protein synthesis blockers used in Nader and Ledoux's reconsolidation experiments were so effective. They interrupted the molecular process that makes memories permanent. The memory research of Paul Franklin at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto has illuminated another dimension of memory storage that is important for understanding why memories change over time. New neurons are continuously generated in the adult hippocampus through a process called adult neurogenesis. As these new neurons are incorporated into hippocampal circuits, they can disrupt existing memory traces by changing the circuitry in which those traces are stored. This process, which Franklin calls memory clearance, may be one reason why early childhood memories are so difficult to access in adults. The high rate of hippocampal neurogenesis in early childhood may actively disrupt the storage of early memories before they can be transferred to more stable cortical storage. It may also contribute to the general fading of older memories over time. The hippocampus is not a permanent storage site. It is a temporary processing site that transfers memories to the neocortex, and the process of transfer takes weeks to years and is never fully complete for complex episodic memories. The engram concept, which refers to the physical trace of a specific memory in the brain, has moved from theoretical postulate to direct experimental investigation through the work of Susumu Tonegawa's group at MIT and other laboratories using optogenetic techniques. Optogenetics allows researchers to label the specific neurons that are active during a learning experience and then reactivate exactly those neurons using light. Using this approach, researchers have been able to demonstrate that specific memories are stored in specific, identifiable sets of neurons, that reactivating those neurons produces recall of the associated memory, and that the content of memories can be manipulated by activating or silencing specific engram neurons. In a striking experiment published in Nature in 2013 by Steve Ramirez, Shu Liu, and colleagues in Tonegawa's group, mice were given a false memory of being shocked in a context they had never been shocked in by reactivating the engram neurons for one context while delivering a shock in a different context. The mice subsequently showed fear responses to the context they had never actually been shocked in, demonstrating a behaviorally consequential false memory produced through direct engram manipulation. This is false memory implantation at the neuronal level. The implications for our understanding of memory accuracy and for future potential therapeutic interventions in conditions like PTSD are profound. The specific research on source monitoring and its failures is something I want to go into in more depth, because source monitoring errors are one of the most common and most consequential forms of memory distortion in everyday life. Source monitoring is the cognitive process of tracking the origin of memories and knowledge, remembering not just that you know something, but where you learned it, not just that you experienced something, but the specific context in which you experienced it. Research by Marcia Johnson and collaborators at Cornell and Yale, whose framework on source monitoring is foundational in the field, has shown that source information is encoded separately from content information and is more vulnerable to forgetting. This means that you can vividly remember the content of something, a specific fact, a specific image, a specific event, while having completely lost the source information, where it came from, whether it was something you experienced directly or heard about, whether it was real or imagined. When source monitoring fails, a range of systematic errors result. You may remember an idea as your own when you heard it from someone else. You may remember as a real memory something you only imagined or dreamed. You may remember as an actual experience of a friend, something you read in a novel. You may attribute a memory of a crime to the wrong person because you saw that person's photograph in a police lineup rather than at the crime scene. The phenomenon called cryptomnesia, which is the unintentional plagiarism of ideas or phrases, is a source monitoring error. You remember the content, but forget that you encountered it elsewhere and experience it as your own original thought. George Harrison was famously sued for plagiarism over his song My Sweet Lord, which closely resembled He's So Fine by the Chiffons. Harrison himself believed the melody was original. The court found unconscious copying. The research on source monitoring errors makes this kind of case completely comprehensible as a genuine memory failure rather than deliberate theft. The eyewitness testimony research deserves considerably more depth than I gave it earlier because the implications are so practically important and the specific mechanisms so well documented. The seminal research was conducted by Elizabeth Loftus, but subsequent decades of research have elaborated the picture substantially. The research on eyewitness identification, specifically the accuracy with which witnesses can identify the perpetrator of a crime from a lineup or photo array, has documented consistent and serious errors. Gary Wells at Iowa State University, who has been one of the most important researchers in this area, has identified specific procedural factors in how eyewitness identifications are conducted that systematically increase error rates. Lineup administrator bias. When the person conducting the lineup knows which member is the suspect, they can inadvertently communicate that information to the witness through subtle cues, increasing the rate of selection of the suspect regardless of actual recognition. Simultaneous versus sequential lineup presentation. Presenting all members of the lineup at the same time encourages witnesses to identify the person who looks most like the perpetrator relative to the other lineup members. rather than making an absolute identification based on actual recognition. Sequential presentation, seeing one person at a time and making a yes or no decision before seeing the next, reduces relative judgments and has been shown to reduce false identifications without proportionally reducing accurate identifications. Filler selection. If the non-suspect members of the lineup do not match the witness's description of the perpetrator as well as the suspect does, the suspect stands out in a way that biases identification. Confidence inflation, expressing doubt to a witness after they have made an identification, followed by subsequent confirmation that they identified the suspect, inflates the witness's expressed confidence far above its pre-confirmation level, producing the appearance of a highly confident identification when the original identification was actually tentative. All of these factors operate without the witness being aware of them. The witness experiences their identification as a genuine recognition, not as the product of subtle procedural influences on a genuinely uncertain process. Research on own race bias in eyewitness identification has documented one of the most robust and most replicated findings in the eyewitness research literature. People are significantly better at recognizing faces of their own race than faces of other races. The effect is large and consistent across studies. The mechanism involves perceptual expertise. People who have had extensive experience looking at faces of a particular demographic group develop more specialized neural machinery for processing those faces, allowing more fine-grained discrimination between individuals. Less exposure to faces of other groups means less specialized processing and therefore poorer discrimination. The practical consequence in the legal domain is that cross-race eyewitness identifications are substantially less reliable than same-race identifications, a fact that most jurors are not aware of, and that can profoundly affect the fairness of trials involving cross-race identifications. The stress and trauma memory research is something I want to go into with more precision because there is a significant and important distinction between two things that are often conflated. The first is that emotionally arousing events are remembered more vividly than neutral events. This is true, and the mechanism involves the amygdala's enhancement of hippocampal consolidation. The second, which does not follow from the first, is that more vivid memories are more accurate memories. The research consistently shows that vividness and accuracy are dissociable. The mechanism through which high emotional arousal can impair rather than enhance accuracy in certain aspects of memory is called weapon focus. Research on weapon focus, first documented by Loftus and Meso, showed that witnesses to violent crimes involving weapons spend disproportionate attentional resources on the weapon at the expense of other details, including the perpetrator's face. Eyewitnesses to armed robberies are good at remembering the weapon and poor at identifying the perpetrator. The narrowing of attention under high arousal, which is an adaptive response that focuses resources on the most immediately threat-relevant stimulus, comes at the cost of encoding of other aspects of the scene. The result is a vivid, emotionally charged memory that is accurate about the central threat stimulus and inaccurate about the peripheral details that are most relevant for legal identification. The role of memory in the maintenance of trauma is something I want to address with care because it connects the basic science to one of the most clinically important applications of memory research. Post-traumatic stress disorder involves a specific pattern of memory dysfunction, intrusive re-experiencing of the traumatic event in the form of flashbacks and nightmares, hypervigilance to cues associated with the trauma, avoidance of reminders of the trauma, and the characteristic fragmentation of trauma memory that I described earlier. The neuroscience of PTSD involves a specific pattern of amygdala hyperreactivity combined with reduced hippocampal volume and activity that impairs the contextualization of threat responses. In PTSD, the amygdala fires as though the trauma is occurring in the present in response to cues that merely resemble elements of the original trauma. And the hippocampus, which would normally provide the contextual information that the threat is historical rather than present, fails to modulate the amygdala response effectively. The treatments for PTSD that have the strongest evidence base, including prolonged exposure therapy and EMDR, both involve the deliberate reactivation of trauma memories in conditions that support their reconsolidation with new, less threatening contextual information. In prolonged exposure, the patient repeatedly revisits the trauma narrative in a safe, therapeutic context, allowing the memory to be reconsolidated with the new contextual information that the trauma is over, that it is survivable, and that discussing it is not dangerous. The repeated revisiting of the memory in this new context gradually modifies the memory's emotional charge through reconsolidation, reducing the amygdala response to the memory over time. EMDR, which involves bilateral stimulation, typically through eye movements, while the patient holds the trauma in mind, is thought to work partly through a similar mechanism. The bilateral stimulation may reduce the arousal during memory retrieval, allowing the memory to be reconsolidated with less emotional charge. The neuroscience of reconsolidation provides a mechanism for understanding why these treatments work that goes beyond the behavioral descriptions of their effects. The research on prospective memory and its improvement is something I want to address more specifically, because prospective memory is the type of memory that most directly affects daily functioning and yet receives the least attention in most discussions of memory science. Prospective memory failures, forgetting to do things you intended to do, are among the most common and most frustrating failures in daily life. The research on implementation intentions, specific mental simulations of the form, when I encounter situation X, I will perform action Y, dramatically improves prospective memory success rates. Studies by Peter Gollwitzer at New York University and collaborators have shown that implementation intentions improve follow-through on intentions by a factor of 2 to 3 in many contexts, across domains, from medication adherence to voting participation to physical exercise. The mechanism is that the implementation intention creates a memory link between the environmental cue, the specific situation X, and the intended action, the specific action Y, so that when the cue is encountered, the intention is automatically retrieved without requiring effortful monitoring. The practical application is direct. If there is something you need to remember to do, form a specific implementation intention that specifies the exact cue and the exact action rather than simply intending to do it. When I walk in the door from work, I will immediately put my keys on the hook. When I sit down to breakfast, I will take my medication. When the meeting ends, I will send the follow-up email. The specificity of the cue and action is what makes the implementation intention effective. Vague intentions, I will remember to do this, are much less reliably translated into action than specific implementation intentions that create an automatic cue action link. The concept of memory as a social and relational phenomenon is another dimension I want to address, because much of the research on memory focuses on individual cognition, while the reality of how memory functions in human social life is substantially relational. Collaborative memory, the process by which groups of people remember together, has been shown to both enhance and impair memory in specific ways. Groups who try to recall something together often produce more total information than any individual member could alone through the cueing and completion effects of collaborative recall. But collaborative recall also produces collaborative errors. When one group member confidently recalls something incorrectly, that incorrect information is incorporated into the memories of other group members through the same social learning mechanisms that make human knowledge accumulation possible. The social contagion of memory, documented by Henry Roediger and collaborators, shows that hearing a Confederate recall non-presented items can cause subjects to subsequently recall those items as their own memories at rates substantially above baseline. In the context of a family or close social group with a shared history, the memories that are rehearsed in group storytelling become the dominant memories for all group members, regardless of whether they reflect the actual experience of each individual member. The memory of the family is not the sum of the individual members' memories. It is a socially constructed narrative that has been shaped by which stories were told, by whom, how often, and with what emotional emphasis. Individual memories that contradict the group narrative tend to be suppressed or revised over time. And the absence of certain memories from the group narrative, the events that are never discussed, can produce a kind of social amnesia in which entire chapters of shared history become inaccessible to the group members. This is why family therapy often involves making explicit the stories that have not been told, and why historical truth commissions focus on giving public voice to memories that have been systematically suppressed. Let me close with something that I think is the most personally important implication of all of this research, something that connects the science of memory to how you actually live and how you relate to the people in your life. The understanding that memory is reconstructive, that every act of remembering changes the memory, that your past is continuously being rewritten in light of who you are now, is not primarily a reason for epistemological anxiety. It is primarily an invitation to a different relationship with your own history. If your memories are not fixed recordings, but living reconstructions, then the meaning of your past is not fixed either. The interpretation you have placed on your childhood, on your formative relationships, on the experiences that shaped you, is not the only interpretation possible. It is the interpretation that made sense given what you understood when you formed it, and given what you have rehearsed since. Different understanding brought to the same memories produces different reconstructions, different contexts, different emotional states, different conversations, different therapeutic encounters. All provide opportunities for the memories that constitute your personal history to be reconsolidated with new meaning. This is not a comfortable truth if you are invested in the certainty of your own narrative. But it is an extraordinarily freeing truth if you are willing to hold your personal history as something that, like the brain itself, is capable of genuine change. The research does not tell you to doubt everything you remember. It tells you to hold your memories as your brain's best current reconstruction of the past, rather than as the past itself. And in that distinction is the space for something genuinely important, the possibility that the story you tell yourself about who you are and where you came from is one that you are still writing, not one that was written for you by events that are now fixed and finished. Memory is not the enemy of change. Memory, properly understood, is one of the most powerful tools for it. Thank you for your time. There are a few more areas I want to develop to reach the full depth this topic deserves. The research on the relationship between memory and imagination is one of the most fascinating and most counterintuitive findings in contemporary cognitive neuroscience. For most of the history of psychology, memory and imagination were considered distinct capacities. Memory reaches back to record the past. Imagination reaches forward to construct the possible. But the neuroimaging research of the past 2 decades has revealed that memory and imagination share, to a remarkable degree, the same neural machinery. Research by Donna Rose Addis, Daniel Schachter, and their colleagues has shown that the neural networks activated during episodic memory retrieval, the recall of specific personal past events, and the neural networks activated during episodic future thinking, imagining specific future events, overlap substantially, involving the same core network, including the hippocampus, medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and lateral temporal cortex. This is sometimes called the default network or the imagination network. And its involvement in both memory and future thinking suggests that these are not separate capacities, but expressions of the same fundamental cognitive process. The constructive simulation process that allows you to mentally travel back to a specific past event is the same process that allows you to mentally simulate a specific future event. And this makes theoretical sense. The purpose of episodic memory is not archival, but constructive. You do not need an accurate record of the past for its own sake. You need the ability to extract information from the past and use it to simulate the future, to guide decisions about novel situations by analogy with past experience. The constructive, reconstructive character of memory that makes it vulnerable to distortion is the same character that makes it an extraordinarily flexible tool for simulation and planning. This connection explains a finding that initially seems paradoxical. People with amnesia who cannot form new episodic memories are not only unable to remember their past, they are also unable to imagine their future in the usual way. When asked to imagine a future event, such as what they might do next weekend, amnesic patients produce sparse, poorly structured, generic descriptions rather than the rich, specific, spatiotemporally coherent simulations that healthy individuals produce. The hippocampus that is necessary for forming new episodic memories is also necessary for constructing vivid episodic simulations of the future. Memory and imagination are not merely analogous processes. They are the same process operating in different temporal directions. The neuroscience of forgetting is an area that completes the picture of memory in important ways, because forgetting is not simply the failure of memory. It is an active process with its own mechanisms and its own adaptive functions. The most familiar form of forgetting is passive decay. Memories that are not retrieved or rehearsed gradually fade as the synaptic traces that support them are not maintained. This is transience in Schachter's framework, but there is also active forgetting, the deliberate suppression of unwanted memories, which has been demonstrated to involve inhibitory mechanisms in the prefrontal cortex that suppress the retrieval of the target memory. Research by Michael Anderson at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit in Cambridge, using the think-no-think paradigm in which subjects repeatedly suppress retrieval of specific learned associates, has shown that deliberate suppression of memory retrieval produces genuine forgetting of the suppressed memories, not merely a failure to retrieve them in the moment. The suppression activates prefrontal inhibitory control mechanisms that reduce the accessibility of the memory over time. And crucially, this forgetting generalizes beyond the specific cue used during suppression. The memory becomes less accessible to other retrieval cues as well. This provides a neural mechanism for motivated forgetting, the selective forgetting of unwanted memories through active suppression that is distinct from passive decay and that operates through cortical inhibitory control rather than through passive fading. The clinical relevance for PTSD and for other conditions involving unwanted intrusive memories is significant, though the relationship between deliberate suppression and subsequent memory intrusion is complex. Research has shown that suppression of unwanted memories can, under some conditions, reduce subsequent intrusions. Under other conditions, consistent with the ironic process theory of Daniel Wegner, suppression can paradoxically increase subsequent intrusion. The conditions that determine which outcome occurs are an active area of research. The research on infantile amnesia, the near universal inability to remember events from the first 2 to 3 years of life, provides another window into the mechanisms of memory storage and development. Despite the common view that early childhood experiences have profound and lasting effects on psychological development, adults have essentially no direct episodic memories from before age 2 or 3, and very sparse memories from age 3 to 5. Several mechanisms have been proposed to explain this. The hippocampus, which is necessary for the formation of explicit episodic memories, undergoes significant postnatal development and does not reach its mature form until approximately 3 to 4 years of age. The process of adult neurogenesis in the hippocampus, which I mentioned earlier in the context of memory clearance, is particularly intense in early childhood, which may actively disrupt the storage of early memories before they can be transferred to stable cortical storage. And the narrative framework that organizes autobiographical memory, the capacity to embed memories in a temporal causal narrative that locates events in the personal story, develops through language acquisition and through social interactions in which caregivers help children construct narratives of their experiences. Research has shown that the language in which early memories are encoded and rehearsed influences their accessibility in later life. Events that were first described in a language the child later stops speaking show lower accessibility than events described in a continuing language, even when the child is tested in the original language. The memory is tied to the linguistic and narrative framework available at the time of its formation. These findings have important implications for claims about the influence of very early childhood experiences. While neural development and attachment experiences in the first years of life have genuine and lasting effects on brain development, these effects operate through mechanisms distinct from the storage of specific episodic memories that can be later recalled. The specific research on memory and aging is something I want to address because it is directly relevant to a large proportion of people engaging with this material, and because the findings are more nuanced and more hopeful than popular narrative about age and memory suggests. The most commonly studied form of age-related memory change is the reduction in working memory capacity, which is the ability to hold and manipulate information in mind over brief periods, and the slowing of processing speed, which affects the rate at which new information can be encoded and retrieved. These changes begin in the third decade and continue gradually through the lifespan, with acceleration after approximately age 65 in many people. Episodic memory, the memory for specific personal past events, shows more substantial age-related decline than semantic memory, which is memory for general knowledge. Older adults are generally better at remembering what they know than at remembering when and where they learned it. Source monitoring becomes more difficult with age, which is one reason older adults are more susceptible to certain types of false memory. However, the picture is far from uniformly negative. Semantic memory, the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime, shows minimal decline and can continue to grow throughout life. Emotional regulation and emotional memory show different patterns with aging than neutral memory. Older adults tend to show a positivity effect in memory, remembering positive events better than negative ones relative to younger adults, which is associated with more effective emotional regulation. And the crystallized intelligence that accumulates with decades of experience, the wisdom and pattern recognition that comes from extensive engagement with the world, continues to grow into very advanced age in many individuals. The research on cognitive reserve, the concept that more education, more cognitively stimulating occupational and leisure activities, and more social engagement are associated with greater resistance to age-related cognitive decline and to the clinical manifestation of Alzheimer's disease, provides one of the most practically important findings in aging research. While cognitive reserve does not prevent the neuropathological changes of Alzheimer's disease, it appears to delay their expression as clinical symptoms, providing additional years of functional independence. The specific mechanism involves the development of more robust and more diversified neural networks that can maintain function despite accumulating damage. Engaging in cognitively demanding activities, learning new skills, maintaining social relationships, and physical exercise all contribute to building and maintaining cognitive reserve, which is perhaps the most powerful available tool for preserving memory function through aging. I want to close by returning to something I said at the beginning, which is that the research on memory does not give you a past you can trust completely. But I want to go a step further than I did then and say something about what that means for how you relate to other people. Every relationship involves two people who have shared some history. And every shared history, because of the reconstructive nature of memory, will be remembered differently by each person involved. This is not because one person is right and the other is wrong. It is because each person's memory of the shared experience has been shaped by everything they brought to it, everything they knew and felt at the time, and everything that has happened since. The arguments that couples have about what happened in specific past events, arguments where both people are absolutely certain of their version and cannot understand how the other person could possibly remember it differently, these arguments are not evidence of dishonesty. They are evidence of two reconstructive memory systems that started from the same raw material and produced different reconstructions shaped by different perspectives, different emotional responses, different prior experiences, and different subsequent rehearsals. The research does not tell you that both memories are equally accurate. It tells you that neither is likely to be a complete and accurate record of what actually occurred. And the appropriate response to that is not to abandon the attempt to understand what happened. It is to approach the disagreement with the curiosity of two scientists who have different data from the same event and are trying to figure out together what the event actually was, rather than the adversarial certainty of two advocates who are each convinced they hold the complete truth. In relationships, in legal contexts, in therapy, in history, in how we construct personal identity, the understanding that memory is reconstructive has implications that are both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it requires giving up the comfortable certainty that what you remember is what happened. Liberating because it opens the possibility that the past is more fluid, more revisable, and more amenable to new meaning than the recording model of memory would allow. The neuroscience of memory is ultimately a neuroscience of the self. Your memories are not the record of who you were. They are the living, changing construction of who you are. Thank you for your time.